This webinar is co-presented by Praxis and the National Association for Museum Exhibitions, a professional network of the American Alliance of Museums, and one of the largest networks in AAM. If you're not yet a member, go to the AAM website, and also note that NAME has its own website at name-aam.org. NAME provides outstanding resources for exhibition professionals, including a quarterly journal, Exhibition, sponsored sessions at the AAM annual meeting, professional development programs, and social gatherings like this one, and regional representation no matter where you live or work. Carolyn Harris, one of today's panelists, and I, your host, are regional representatives for the Mountains Plains region and the New England region, respectively. You can contact us or your regional rep through the NAME website, and I just want to add one final note that this webinar is being recorded. The Praxis Museum Project Group is a network of museum professionals, each of whom brings an established and particular expertise to the process of creating exhibitions and cultural experiences of all types. Members of Praxis are leaders in their respective fields and belong to Praxis in order to advance their individual expertise, learn from each other, and extend the benefits of collaboration to their clients and the museum field as a whole. I wish you personal greetings from Salem, Massachusetts, Halloween capital of the USA. With the timing of this program in the last week of October, and given that budgeting can be a rather tricky and horrifying conversation for some, we've themed this program just a bit around the nightmares that can haunt museum projects when it comes to budgeting. This program will feature a presentation followed by questions and answers. You may use the chat feature to deposit your observations, provide banter amongst yourselves, and contribute feedback. Any one of you can use the chat and save the chat at any time if someone provides a valuable idea or link. For this particular webinar, select members of Praxis have put their severed heads together to contemplate one of the most important first steps in any project, setting an appropriate budget. Each of our presenters will briefly introduce themselves as they are given the floor. Full bios of Praxis members can be found on our website. During the webinar, questions to the panelists should be put in the Q&A so that we may manage them and answer as many as possible in our time together. You may post them to the Q&A stream at any time, and please post them as they occur to you. Since this is a Zoom webinar, and as opposed to a meeting, you will remain muted as an attendee unless we intentionally unmute you to clarify a point. So with that, let's get started. My name is Matt Kirkman, and I'm an interpretive planner and exhibition developer from Salem, Massachusetts. We are thrilled here today to share some lessons learned and observations on how the culture and survival of a project is impacted by one of its very first steps, the setting of a workable target budget. An inappropriate budget can be a nightmare. Innovative design becomes a fantasy. So how does one home in on reality? Here's one thing I can confidently say. No one wants their project to be over budget, and unanticipated costs leading to being over budget usually delays the schedule as well. This compound situation causes stress to museum leadership, board members, donors, and the project team. The Praxis group has been having this conversation about how we continually hear within the industry that clients often expect extraordinary results, but then set unrealistic budgets. Online sources prove unhelpful and sometimes worse, misleading. If one Googles how much should a museum cost or how much do exhibitions cost, you'll find wide ranges. You'll find 200 square feet for new museum construction and recommendations for less than $150 a square foot for quite complex exhibits. So we collectively as a group were taken aback by this information. Some published budget averages are quite out of date, and others have been slow to keep up with new visions for what museums are and what exhibitions do best to engage their audiences. So in order to serve the field, the Praxis group formally polled our professional networks and surveyed our own projects. We analyzed 39 museum projects that are either completed in the last 5 years or currently in development. And today we're going to share the results of that effort and talk about what really should go into setting a museum budget. A few things to note. Our findings represent museums that aim to feature immersive and interactive experiences versus static displays of objects or art. We are assuming a level of complexity, and we will talk more about that. We offer insight for projects including new museum construction and museum building renovations, and parts of our discussion will encompass an entire museum project budget, not just the exhibitions. It is our aim that through the research and dialogue like this, Praxis can provide newly accessible and accurate budget outlines. So here on this slide, why are project goals important? How do you avoid being over budget or delayed? There are many reasons, but the number one reason that projects can get into trouble early on is that project leadership might not always give enough informed thought and honest discussion to the project goals. Project goals are the beacon. They are the North Star for the project's team. Its stakeholders, its in-house staff, and outside consultants and vendors. The ideal list of project goals is presented here. The mission, target audience, interpretive planning goals, the scope and program of space needs, including a vision for architectural and exhibition design, the target budget, which is the focus of this conversation, a target schedule, testing and alignment with fundraising feasibility in order to keep pace with the schedule and the overall project budget, and a target annualized operational budget, including a staffing plan. And with that information laid as groundwork for today's presentation, I want to pass to Chris Collins.
Good afternoon, Chris Collins at MGAC. Thank you, Matt. Today we're just tackling the target budget because there is just so much to consider. Over many years of doing project-based work, at the end of a project, we always learn a ton when we consider how projects get started compared to how they end up. We always learn from each museum project when key stakeholders involved are asked, did the eventual reality of what it actually cost match the initial target budget? At the beginning, did the project set up enduring guardrails surrounding budget? What horrifying things happened along the way that we should have done differently? So one of the biggest problems we have collectively see in the industry is that owners start projects with unrealistic budgets that leave out critical costs that should have been considered. Owner teams also don't always establish a clear priority when they engage design professionals, that sticking to the budgets is important. We've found that many primary project owners and key stakeholders want what they want and are willing to increase budgets or ignore escalating costs as the design evolves. But ask yourself first, should museums just plan to fundraise more? Is there capacity for increased donations? Is there a risk of cratering trust with previous donors that committed to a different vision or target budget? Today, we're going to explore an idealized method for developing a target budget, tricks to keeping on track, and some suggestions for those who are tasked with creating a project plan and target budgets. So on this slide here, you see, this is an actual published story for a major museum project. $200 million budget balloons to $400 million before being scrapped completely. Sounds like something we want to avoid. Today we'll talk about how to be proactive and not make several common mistakes when starting a capital project. We have prepared the dirty dozen items to keep an eye on. Whoops, there's the dirty dozen. Early in a project goal and budget setting period. These are based on input from our Praxis members and input from numerous exhibit designers as well. The information is not specific to any project or client, and we agreed to keep the data confidential so we can learn from real life experience. As they say on the movie poster, damn them or praise them, you'll never forget the dirty dozen. Okay, so number one, don't skip the feasibility study. So think about it, projects are essentially business propositions. And we notice that owners and design professionals often charge ahead into projects without knowing existing conditions for which the work will be built upon, agreeing on the main objectives, the expected program, understanding the expected costs, having a clear work plan, and some basic understanding of what their staffing and operational plan will be. They also need to confirm the interpretive plan, as Matt discussed. These are all basic questions that a feasibility study can answer at a conceptual level to set a project out on the right path. A feasibility study is a relatively short period to prepare, and the results of rushing into a design phase without a clear plan will result in a floating budget. It'll be all over the place. If your project is small or large, it's a good thing to do this study and get buy-in from some really smart people that are invested in the project's success. A feasibility study may also mean visitor surveys, asking why you're doing a project as opposed to what it will cost. So Kathleen, let's talk about benchmarking.
I'm Kathleen Bradley with Cubic Maltby, a fabricator. So we're fortunate to be part of a community of professionals who are fairly open to sharing information and experiences for the benefit of the industry. However, as we said before, much of the data floating around the internet is both outdated and accurate. So when you begin the planning process, do your research. And part of that should be speaking to other similar institutions about what they've been spending on renovations and construction. We've taken our own advice and, as we mentioned, collected data from 39 different projects from reputable institutions who have completed their projects recently. So I'll hand it back to Chris.
So the hard costs are the largest part of a project budget, right? These are construction, infrastructure, exhibit fabrication, AV hardware, and media production. So look at the dashed yellow line on your screen that surround the two hard cost categories in black and pink. So black is for construction infrastructure, pink is for exhibit fabrication, AV hardware, exhibit lighting, and media production. Rightfully so, hard costs are the majority of the project's costs. In our analysis, we observe where clients are creating a new museum building, and as a percentage of the hard cost budget, the exhibit budget, which is pink, is half of what it would be in a renovation project. This makes logical sense to everyone, right? That if we're going to build a new museum, the building construction would cost more relative to the total budget. Again, this is average, but it's surprising to me still how many clients and people in the industry are still thinking that a museum should be put into a brand new building compared to renovating an existing property, especially now with all the pandemic vacated office buildings, right? Now, it's not always less if you're going to repurpose an existing building. If you're moving structural bays, adding new elevators, stairs, reskinning a building, it all depends on the market and the property.
So first, I wanted to talk a little bit about the team that you will put together. I'm Carolyn Harris Consulting. I am a museum planner and I specialize in new museums, renovations of galleries, and large exhibition projects. So here on, and I just want to remind everyone, you know, we do talk about architects and exhibit designers and a lot of building projects, but all of the data in this webinar applies to just large exhibition projects, like a renovation of a gallery or a large exhibit redo. So they translate that way. So I just want to remind everyone of that. But in this case, we just want to make sure that you don't set your budget without talking to your team and sort of engaging your team. And when talking about an architect and exhibit designer, most folks will hire an architect before understanding what the visitor experience should be. And from day one, that means you are fitting an exhibition into a space instead of collaborating on the best visitor experience, back of house, services, and other issues surrounding that exhibit and building. And just as an aside, you should separate the contracts for your architect and exhibit designer instead of having one as a subcontract to the other. And that we could do a whole webinar about that, but that's just a side note. But let's back up for a minute. Before you even hire this exhibition designer or architect, are you ready? Planners and other consultants can help develop and establish your goals, evaluate your audience needs, and prepare your stakeholders and test budget assumptions. Like, do you really need that big of a building? Or do you really need that big of an exhibit? What does your community really want? Have you researched this? You may be overbuilding or underbuilding. Again, it's a big mistake to start designing your building and experience before you have these basics in hand and stakeholder buy-in. And I just want to do a little shameless plug about Is Your Museum Ready? Because Matt and I are going to be doing that as an upcoming Praxis webinar, if that's something that you are interested in. So let's talk about soft costs, because this is a big part of the team engagement and understanding your entire budget. So next slide. So what are soft costs? Which, by the way, these can be anywhere between 15 and 25% of your entire budget. These are costs that are paid to people and not materials and construction. However, they can be considered for each case. So if, for example, some people ask if exhibit design costs should be considered soft costs or part of the overall exhibit budget. They really should be separate as soft costs, not part of your exhibit budget. This is a line item just like your architect's fees, and it can fluctuate based on scope and timing. So who are all these soft cost people and why do they cost so much? They can be project managers, I've mentioned architect and exhibit designers. They can be visitor studies folks, market demand study, people who translate into different languages, audio guide producers, your rights and permissions, researchers and fees, the list goes on. And so why are they so expensive? And some people say, well, my staff person makes X and this consultant is asking for Y. Because wrapped up in all of those fees are their own overhead, benefits, administration costs, and other things. Also, you're hiring them because they have years of experience in this specific task. So they should be very efficient at what they do and end up actually saving you money in the long run because you're not going to make some very expensive mistakes downstream. Soft costs for outside design professionals, as I mentioned, are about 15 to 25%. And this is sort of a rule of thumb for an average. But this doesn't include like your media producer. That should be part of your exhibit budget. So Chris, take it from here.
Great. So on the next slide, you're going to see, we're going to talk about not pinching pennies up front. What you want to do is think of it as investment, right? Sometimes we see that clients are hesitant to spend money up front, or they're conflicted on how to even get started so they can go start fundraising. So the old adage, when you want an omelet, you got to break some eggs, and it really holds true. I want to reiterate that spending money for the initial work plan is vital. It helps you explain to donors and stakeholders what you're doing and establish credibility that there is a real business plan. There are some benefits for having a separate study team up front versus picking a designer for the whole thing before you even have a plan. Service providers are expendable, and it's a limited engagement for specific tasks. This is a good thing for clients. If it's not working out or if a task is complete, clients get to decide if there is value to continue the relationship or take some time to allow fundraising support for the project. There's a simple principle: planning is less expensive than change orders, right? Goals and principles should lead the design effort that solves the identifiable problems. The design should not be making chaos by solving problems that don't exist. Have you ever heard someone say, dream big now, there's always time later to cut back if you can't afford the design? I actually had a client tell me this once. I explained this is very problematic because you're designing without a real constraint on budget. And if you do this for very long, you lose time and money on redesign and trying to save money after the bids come in. You will honestly get cents on the dollar for cutting scope after the bids get in, guaranteed. So establishing a realistic initial budget is high value. It has the most impact early in the project. Your ability to effectively make design change diminishes with time. Early concept design changes are easy to make, whereas once the technical construction drawings are complete, it costs you time and money. So on this next slide, you're going to see a sample cost distribution. So when you're considering a feasibility study period, keep in mind that a feasibility study would cost less than 1% of a total project budget. Often it's less than 0.5%. Isn't that money and time well spent to get a project off on the right foot? Again, don't start saving money before you've even set a budget. Now, regarding an existing building, next slide, we want to pay attention to its condition, okay? When you're going to do a renovation to an existing building, they often have long-term deferred maintenance needs. Ignoring these conditions will cause an increase of at least 10, 20, could be 40%. Please have a physical condition assessment done before doing any work, or is also known as a PCA. It's shocking to me that when we have clients that buy an existing building for renovation or plan to renovate a building they own, that the buildings aren't being proactively maintained and the records are terrible sometimes. With construction infrastructure being such a large part of any project budget, it's critical to know what you have first. If it's just infrastructure upgrades needed for new exhibits in an existing building, that is a huge unknown that needs just a little bit of study before establishing a target budget. Sites have major impacts on budgets and schedule. You have to look at the soil conditions, utilities, zoning, review boards, parking, city zoning process. keep all these in mind and study those issues early.
And so with respect to the idea of deinstalling and reusing exhibit parts and pieces, traditionally, people will say, that's a great idea. Let's just reuse our cases. Let's just reuse this mount. Let's just reuse, this exhibit panel. We'll reapply something. Depending on the life cycle of that exhibit, that could be a very bad idea. Also, you end up, designing around something instead of having your exhibit be more holistic. Of course, you always want to try to save money where you can. And there's also the aspect of sometimes they're really iconic exhibits that the public will not want you to get rid of. It's beloved by the community. So definitely, look at those. Also, does it need conservation? Does it need to be a little bit refurbished? Just don't think that you can just move it and plop it down and there could be zero costs associated with it. Oftentimes you might have to move it out of the space too, and then move it back into the space. So when you're thinking about, reusing things, it's not a zero cost issue.
I'm Trent Oliver from Blue Telescope, not to be confused with Bride of Frankenstein here. And like Bride of Frankenstein, you don't want to be like her. You want to act as a leader. If you're the leader within your museum, you really want to make sure that there's a clear process, that whatever the big idea, the goals of your museum, that you stick to it. If that work was really done well at identifying that, then you're looking at a very clear why you're doing the project, and that's the most vital thing. Make sure that all your partners share that same vision and are very clear on how are you going to approve things. Is there one single point of contact who is the approver on the museum side to anything that happens? And make sure it's very clear, because it can get muddy fast. And then lead your team towards your end goal and objective. Keep those goals handy, print them out, keep going over. Why are we doing this? Oh, this is why we're doing this. And if anything isn't pointing at your big idea, don't do it. It requires a lot of disciplined leadership to stay on track with whatever your original goal was. And if leadership goes off on a tangent, everybody else will. Now, of course, every now and then you should stop and say, is this a good idea? Is this goal really a good idea? Just to check, but keeping in mind that going back and doing redesign will cost time, it'll cost money, and we get it. The concepting phase, when you're just coming up with great ideas, that is a blast. That's a lot of fun. But once the concept and design are approved, leave them approved and help your team understand that this is the process to build, such a large creation like a museum. It's a series of small yeses, small approvals, and that if something was approved 6 months ago, has changes or tweaks, there has to really be a good reason for it, because you will be spending additional money and time. I mean, if you have a new sponsor and you have to print all new graphics, hey, that's something worth it, but it is expensive. You just don't want it to be something that you weren't planning on. You want to make sure that whatever you're creating, it's very useful in the long run. And Chris?
Very good. So when you're thinking about Dirty Dozen number 7, please don't assemble a partial budget, right? So when you're doing a conceptual budget, you should try to take in a full view of all the project-related costs. One thing that's helpful is to consider is a very detailed checklist of what could be spent on a project and think through what budget categories would apply. Now, what you see here are the major budget categories where you can spend the money.
Hi, I'm Tom Guiley, and I am a museum exhibit design budget estimator. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the fact that from the very beginning, I try to keep in mind the things that the client should be keeping in mind, because there are plenty of hobgoblins hidden in your project that will come back to haunt you if you don't get them on your list. And these can be things like site issues, who's going to pay for gallery lighting, Does the exhibit lighting package include the in-case lighting and special effects? It could be exhibit related, like, what do you mean you didn't include artifact mounting? We assumed that was part of your bid. So remember, if you think you've thought of everything that needs to go in your budget, you're probably wrong, and you should think again and again and again. Chris, back to you.
Great. So on the next slide here, we're talking about a very detailed thing. You may not be able to see all this. This is actually part of a very thorough budget document that we have at MGAC. The documents, all of the budget line items, just separately. I'd be happy to share this for reference. Just send me an email. I'll have my email at the end. This document has about all the major categories, and there are 140 line items to consider within each of those major categories. Now, it may seem overkill to fill in that budget form at a concept phase, but I'd really just see it as a checklist. Later on, it can be refined. The point is that early on, you try to think of everything you could spend money on. One helpful thing to note is that it's good to identify the party responsible for each of the categories, so you can eventually write contracts and have direction on who is responsible for that item. For instance, some owners want to hire an artifact installer themselves rather than have the party be a subcontractor to the exhibit fabricator. So you can see that on this sample budget here, where it has a responsibility and then has the major parties who would hold those contracts or be responsible for their budget categories. And that just helps people know who's going to be responsible. Next slide.
So Dirty Dozen number 8, don't forget about your staff and plan for it. So, one thing to remember when you're doing a major project is that in an existing museum or in a major exhibition redo, your staff will effectively be doing 2 jobs during most of this project. So really be aware of burnout and delays that can, trying to get everyone on a meeting because they've got other things going on. How do you gather feedback in a timely manner? All of those things can affect your budget. And don't forget that they can have very valuable insight on, the stories you tell to your community, the goals you want to set, the shape of your collections or the gaps in your collection. They can offer really valuable practical thinking. They're on the floor of the museum potentially. So think about your floor staff. It's not just your curator. It's your docents. It's your floor staff. It's people who are their front line with your guest services. They know how your visitors interact with your museum. Your education staff, how does the content fit into the school learning standards of your community? And how can you get more field trips to come to your museum? And then there's the maintenance staff. You're creating something they're going to have to take care of. Why don't you ask them their opinion? 18 different kinds of lights, not really a great idea for someone. And also, you want to engage your donors and your board and your stakeholders, but put some guardrails around it. Their input is really important too. They're important members of your organization and of your community. But oftentimes, some donors can start to railroad things based on their own perspective. So really put some guardrails around that and be careful with that. And Kathleen?
All right, so Dirty Dozen number 9. Don't ignore that little voice in your head when it asks, how is that going to work? So, as a fabricator, I see this all the time, design drawings where things are floating in space or have no legs and are magically suspended. And chances are, if you're wondering how something might work, there are some details that need to be worked out. Unfortunately, 2D doesn't always translate well to the built environment. And the more complex and challenging a design is, the more expensive it will be to build. So when building a project budget, it's important to consider the rationale behind design choices. Carefully consider what's critical to the visitor experience, going back to that big idea and those initial goals you set. And sometimes you may need to look at where there's a more practical approach to what you're trying to achieve. So next slide, please. So we're all in the business of creating these incredible visitor experiences. We want to create environments where people can only experience them when they visit our institutions. It should be special and certain elements should be beyond belief. So sometimes practical doesn't always align with the design intent. That's why it's really important to have those trusted partners in place at the beginning. going back to before when we were talking about building your team, making sure there are people in place who can provide early cost estimates and prototyping, as well as acceptable solutions during prototyping and testing if something doesn't go as planned. This should all be happening during the design phases instead of waiting until the design is complete and approved to ensure that as you're moving through those phases, the budget actually aligns with the design intent. Waiting until the design is complete can be very costly, or worse, lead to value engineering where things are cut. So this lovely vision you see on the screen can end up being this reality. That's something you want to avoid. So next slide, please. So this is an example of a project that came to us and required some forethought to bring it to life. You can see on the screen this really cool DNA helix design, and it was designed to be suspended from the ceiling and light up and have an interactive component. This is something where we looked at it and said, okay, you know, before we estimate this, we really need to figure out how this is going to work to ensure that the estimate is accurate. We're not going back to the client later for more money, and ensure that it actually can be built safely in the way it's designed. So next slide. So part of the process we took that you should consider as you're working on your own projects is trying to figure out, you know, how these complex ideas work in your space. So in order to develop an accurate budget, we actually fully prototyped this DNA helix to ensure that it worked both structurally and the lighting system that was integrated into it worked properly the way the client envisioned it. So during the process, we actually uncovered some flaws, and we were able to correct those and estimate the budget correctly to ensure that there weren't costly change orders or undesirable modifications that changed the design intent. So next slide, please. Here you can see the final exhibit with the DNA helix in place. It looks like the drawings, but it works and it is safe to be suspended above visitors. So I'm going to hand it off now to Tom.
Thank you, Kathleen. We've all heard someone say things like, if you think X is expensive, just try Y. And in that vein, I'd say that if you think insurance is expensive, just try having a disaster at your museum. And if you have enough money in the bank, you don't really need insurance. And that's sort of what an owner's contingency is. Museums and people don't have unlimited funds. But since I don't think there's any insurance company that would ever give you an affordable policy on museum disasters, you need to have built into your budget an owner's contingency. And this is money set aside for the potential errors, emissions, disasters. One thing that you need to do, speaking of omissions and errors, even though you can't usually get insurance on your museum project, you can ask or demand that your engineers and designers have errors and emissions insurance as part of their contract. So when I do a budget estimate for a museum project, I always include a design contingency in my budget estimates. This is to cover early unknowns, misinterpretations, and then later on, unexpected price hikes, surprises on site, et cetera. We start out high, at least 15%, sometimes even higher, depending on the situation. And that's during the concept and schematic phases. As you flesh out the designs and documents during the next phases, design development, et cetera, the percentage drops, but it never disappears. With no contingency, it's called running naked, and we strongly advise against it, especially at Halloween. There's always hidden conditions that you have to consider. The owner's contingency is a contingency in the same way, but it is slightly different. It's a separate fund. It's also a percentage of the budget, which starts out high and decreases as the project moves past the early pitfalls like site flaws and building delays, but it never really disappears until the project is concluded. And although some museum directors hate to hear it, the point is to spend all the money that you've set aside in your budget for the museum. Spend that on the great museum that you're trying to make. And so the owner's contingency can't be a slush fund that you dip into when you want to add an enhancement or get an add alt or something else that you've dreamt of. It needs to be shepherded and guarded until you're sure that you're safe from all those things that go bump in the night. If there's anything left, you can apply it to those items, the ones that you wished for, but you didn't get. But like the budget, the owner's contingency needs to be monitored and revisited on a regular basis. So now I think we're going to move on to Trent and the low-cost proposal dangers.
So a lot of what we're talking about here isn't necessarily, this is what you should do for your museum. This is just kind of good basic ideas. Don't be tempted by the low-cost proposal. In general, whenever you're getting estimates, you're probably going to have one that's way low and one that's way high. Doesn't make sense to keep them. How many times have we heard about the project that started off with one amazing firm, great optimism, everybody was really thrilled, and then we find out later the entire design was scrapped and the whole project started over again, only this time with less time and less money. Whatever is seen is priced. If there's something floating in air, the DNA was beautiful, but if there isn't something showing that how it connects, quite often a supplier will have to just price it that way. It isn't that they're trying to really trick. It's a standard process. As people are being pushed to be cheaper and cheaper, they only price what they see, only price what is detailed instead of what they know it will need. If you go with the lowest, sometimes you could run into a problem. Maybe that business goes out of business. Post-COVID, we've seen it's been rough. You want to make sure that you are working with partners who are solid. You don't want delayed opening. You don't want your museum never happening. And absolutely check all references with whoever you want to work with. Find the firms or people that have experience with the company you're selecting, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the references that have been provided to you. And this is all a big deal. You're trying to find people and partners who are partners in your goals, not vendors who are kind of giving a commodity. When in doubt, go spend a day with whatever firm you're considering working with. It'll cost you money up front, but it'll make things easier in the end. You'll know you're working with the right group for yourself.
Well, let's go to the next slide.
Yeah.
Because the last thing you want to do is end up with, here's your dream, but there's your reality. Nobody, including all of your partners, wants that. Nobody wants that to happen. So think of that as you move forward.
Thank you. Okay, last 30 dozen. Remember our feasibility study. It is, don't leave it to gather dust. It needs care and feeding. It was an investment, maybe not perfect, but it should have defined your project goals, expected cost, expectations for visitors' experience, a work plan. It's okay to modify the project plan later, but do it with your eyes open and continually. Program elements often grow in scale due to creative influence, but a look back at your program of requirements is a good reminder of your business case, which was built on your needs, not your wants. So next slide. So really, some of the questions we have here today is, how much should a museum cost? We're going to walk you through this. At Concept, how do we establish a realistic budget? Now that we kind of talked about the process and all the things that go into it, we're going to talk about how we would break the overall budget into a partitioned categories. That's really the best place to start. Within these budget sections, you can prepare an estimate based on benchmarking. Here's how I develop a museum conceptual budget by major categories. Remember, this budget is established before anything is designed. There's no design, no sketches, no renderings. It's just a program. So first item, exhibit fabrication, exhibit lighting. I want you to go back a slide. Exhibit fabrication, exhibit lighting, and AV hardware all can be conceived at the dollars per square foot, but consider the level of graphics, technology, media, casework, artifacts, and so on. Like Trent talked about, do some benchmarking first and see what you like and inquire what it costs to create. Now, you might need to be sneaky to get this information because people don't like to talk about how much they spent. And then they leave out many of the budget categories when they're talking. They'll be like, oh, well, here's what the exhibits cost. But we had to spend $1 million on electrical infrastructure, right? That's a separate thing. So spend some time if you're doing benchmarking or have someone do it for you. The next piece is media production. So this is software, short films, interactive media. It's based on the expectations of technology and interactive media. It's often calculated as a % of the exhibit budget up front. And I think twice before saying to anybody, we are going to have the state-of-the-art media experience, right? Don't say that unless you have the money to back it up. Museums are becoming more reliant on technology, and procuring media producers is a tricky part of the business. That's another seminar, honestly. In my opinion, we consider media production as part of exhibits cost because it is so integral to the exhibits. Now, the next category is renovation, construction, and infrastructure costs. This can be based off of dollars per square foot based on the expected scope of work. A good cost estimator can develop a conceptual estimate quickly, and it's an affordable, high-value item. Even if you're doing just an exhibit renovation project, the infrastructure costs are not to be ignored or faked. Infrastructure reaches the end of its useful life. That's what happens. And what a perfect time to get updated is in your exhibit project, right? Soft costs, like we talked about before, these can be 15 to 25% of an overall budget on average. And that's probably the best way to put it. Depending on a variety of factors, you'll spend in that range most likely. You can spend more. If you're targeting a well-known starchitect, have your eyes open and make sure you understand what the business terms are and how that would work. Other costs need special attention by going through a budget checklist to ballpark these costs. So, site improvements, legal, fixtures, furniture, and equipment, also known as FF&E, artwork. These can all be ballparked on dollars per square foot based on the program and scope of work. And the owner's contingency, as Tom explained, is to be used for unexpected costs within the budget category. And I always start with at least 15% of it as an owner's contingency. That's 15% of the entire budget. Okay, next slide. So within our 39 museum projects, let's focus on the exhibit-related costs, right? I mean, this is a good study. We got some really interesting data from our network and each other. These are exhibit fabrication costs, exhibit lighting, and AV hardware. That's in blue on the left, and then media production, pink on the right. So we grouped these into small, medium, and large. So small exhibits were 2,000 to 11,000 square feet of exhibit area. Medium exhibits were between 11,000 and 20,000 square feet of exhibit area. And then large exhibits were over 20,000 square feet. Okay, that's not the building, that's just the exhibit area. So each category of small, medium, and large had data from 13 different projects. And the values have been adjusted for inflation to today's dollars. Remember, case studies were either finished within the last 5 years or in the planning stages now. Some people were surprised at the values. Pretty much all sizes were spending between $475 and $500 a square foot for just exhibit fabrication, which includes AV hardware and lighting, plus about $120 to $190 a square foot for media production. Now remember, this is just the average. The mean range of costs was about a 20 to 30% variance from this average that you see here, if I'm going to be general about it. And also there were outliers. There are some that some oddball ones that were lower, just a few, and a few also that were much higher as well. So again, it all depends on the project. Add these together, and these folks are spending about $600 to $700 a square foot in the range for exhibits, AV hardware, exhibit lighting, and media production. So this, again, does not include infrastructure or construction or soft costs. This is just exhibits. You'll notice the larger museums generally have a lower cost per square foot. That's because of their size and efficiency with a giant museum project. Conversely, smaller museums generally spend more because of the inefficiencies to mobilize a team to do work in small areas. Our analysis showed that in general, museum exhibit budgets have about 20 to 30% saved for just media production, right? So if you think about it, you look at the pink on the right, that's about 20 to 30% of the exhibit budget is just for media producers. Okay, next slide. So let's summarize what we've been talking about, and then we'll get into questions next, okay? I think we can all agree that establishing a conceptual budget is not easy. There's so much to consider before declaring a project budget. Site selection should include multi-layered considerations. Generally, renovating an existing building will be less costly on a budget compared to new construction. Think twice about carving up fresh land when you could repurpose an existing building. Benchmarking is so critical. Benchmark your ideas and target experience and costs. Now, program square feet multiplied by the cost per square foot and the percents of budget is the dependable way to establish a conceptual target budget. And do this before you start designing anything. Great thing about dollars per square foot at a concept budget level is that if you have a realistic view of what it will cost to build your project, you might shrink your program of needs so you don't end up over-designed or over-budget. So if the budgets are coming in way higher than what you want to spend, a lot of people don't think, oh, we should make it smaller. That's just, if you don't do that, it's a classic common problem in museum problems. It's the strongest reason for preparing a realistic conceptual target budget. Use the full budget as a checklist early. Again, we're happy to share that checklist. Just send me an email. Museum projects are a team sport. Take an appropriate amount of time and spend some money up front to consider what you're about to get into. And then ask yourself, is it feasible? Is this something you're ready for? You want to tread carefully on the early design work. Don't overcommit to an idea that is not affordable or realistic. It's great to have a fantastic creative vision, but also good to independently verify what that vision is likely to cost all throughout the project. Now, I'll say that realistic and grounded goals result in better projects. The world really is full of cultural projects that start off with lower budgets and end up way over budget. Recently, I heard about another major project that's on the boards right now, and it's exceeding its target budget by 20%, and it's only partway through design. This is really not uncommon. Why it's happening is another story, and I don't know the reasons for it, but I think some of the things we've talked about today are principles to keep an eye on that and establishing a target budget up front that is realistic. You want to keep an eye on costs because that is the best practice, right? Establishing target budgets is just the beginning, and those who don't continually check in on the budget are set up to be surprised later when you can least afford to be written about in the news. There are a million unexpected things to spend money on, and it's best to have a partitioned target budget that receive careful, regular reviews. Time equals money. It's an old adage, but it's so true. We didn't really talk much about schedule, but this does have a real impact on costs. We're actively planning for a much longer period from when you make an award to an exhibit contractor or a general contractor to the time they show up to start work. I think especially in today's world with the pandemic and supply chain problems, it's so important to get orders in early. There are strange shortages on things like projectors and technology, hardware, materials, anything with a chip. And in the past, they've had consistent lead times. And I think you just have to plan ahead for a realistic schedule and build in some cushion. I call this double secret contingency. It's just good to do, and you have to do it more now. So plan for that, because if you don't allow for that, it's going to cost you money, most likely. Lastly, we would love to have you share your data to improve the study. Please send me information about your museum projects that you have. I promise to keep it confidential. I'm happy to sign an NDA because all these museum projects, frankly, have NDAs. So again, it's for the good of the industry. And with that, we'll go to questions.
Thank you very much. I have a list of questions that were posited in the Q&A box. And our first one goes like this. When talking about not redoing approvals, how does a really long timeline play into that, as conditions may change over that time? So how does the length of a project impact how a budget is constructed?
So I'll take that one. This is Carolyn, because I deal with a lot of approval gatherings and coordinatings and board approvals. If you have something that pauses and stops and starts, which is not uncommon due to fundraising or other reasons, it is good to go back and just re-socialize your documentation. You've got a concept design. Let's re-socialize it with our stakeholders, even maybe your community. Let's go back. And it's not to say I'm not asking you to reapprove this. I'm bringing it back up so we all are on the same page. Now, if conditions change, your funding changes, your leadership changes, you can, you don't want to just railroad something regardless, but you want to go in with it gingerly to say, hey, what are the new conditions and how do they affect what our goals are? Go back to your goals, go back to, have some guardrails around it. But you don't want to just say let's throw it out there for we have 8 new board members. Let's throw it out there and see what they think. That's just a recipe for disaster.
Another thing to add on to that, I think that's good, Carolyn, is that when folks are redesigning or designing things and they have a specific window of time, and then we're going to stop. And we've had this, frankly, on a couple of projects where people need more time to fundraise because of the pandemic. It's been hurt the whole industry. There's this great opportunity to we have time to keep fiddling with things, and that's going to cost money from designers, in all fairness. And don't forget to push back on inflation, because time waits for no one. So escalation is just real.
So this is a popular question. Do you happen to have any templates for a feasibility study or any tools to measure staff capacity? We budget for contracted staff time, but we don't budget for museum staff time. And do you have any suggestions for that?
Well, I'll let Chris take the feasibility template piece, but I'll take the staff piece. Chris mentioned the checklist and assigning, roles and responsibilities. A responsibility matrix from the beginning of a project is an incredibly useful tool. So, you have a curator who may have to do some research. You have collections managers who may have to look at objects or go find things. You have leadership who have to, make approvals and review pages and pages and pages of things. Who's reviewing galleys, the proofs for things. Really go through and from the beginning, start to look at who's doing what and where you might need some outside support. Because what happens often, I'm sure there are other people that have this. I get called into projects, way midstream because the people are completely overwhelmed. It's going off into Never Never Land. It's stalled out because no one can make a decision. Because they really haven't looked at what are we going to do and how are we going to do it. So that from the very beginning, any kind of responsibility items helps you sort of manage what that looks like. And the size of the project is going to really dictate, is it going to be 50% of this person's time now? Is it going to be 75? Is it going to be 25? But, and lean on your colleagues that may have done similar projects and see what it impacted with them.
Right, and as for a template for a feasibility study, I think what we did is back on slide 9, why are the project goals important, right? The project goals, and I think we could be happy to share this presentation if folks are interested in that. But the project goals really make the structure for the feasibility study. There's a lot that goes into it, and they're customized documents that are prepared based on the assignment. So I think an example of that would probably be hard to have exactly. I think if someone wants to reach out to me separately, we can talk about that.
Yeah, I would encourage participants to take a screenshot of this slide that's up right now. It has our individual contact information, those of us that were on the panel, and you can always go to the Praxis website to remind yourself who we were and how we can be reached. Here's another question from the floor. I assume that the exhibit fabrication square foot costs just shown do not include any soft costs, that is development and design. Is that correct? And do they include photo and illustration acquisition or the preparation of digital graphic files? Any thoughts on what percent of the overall project costs should go to development and design?
So you're correct that exhibit fabrication costs shown on the screen do not include soft costs. So they typically do include photographic and illustration acquisition and the final digital graphics, yes. As far as a percentage of the overall project cost, I think, again, it depends on the project. And I think as a rule of thumb, when you're developing a conceptual budget, again, I hate to be squishy, but I think it's somewhere in the range of 15 to 25%, depending on the assignment of what we call soft costs. I think you're referring to development and design.
So Chris, in my experience as an interpretive planner and exhibit developer, we often create a separate figure for that photo and illustration acquisition and prep, because we're not always 100% sure what those sources might be. If it's a museum that has a terrific library and all of those images are going to come out of the institution itself, there may be a very low cost there versus a startup museum that may need to go to the Library of Congress or hire photographers or whatever. So we really like to identify where those illustrations and photos might be coming from so that we can create the right slice of pie in the budget.
I think this is an example of one of the things you need to think about very early, because and put it on your list. It's something that I always try to include in my budget estimates when I'm working with a design firm. And it's actually surprising how many times, not the design firm necessarily, but the people who are picking photographs don't realize that you can't just use the photographs you find on the web. You may have to pay for the high quality photograph. And if you've got an iconic photograph in mind, you would end up spending a lot of money to use it. So again, keep these things in mind early on and make sure you set aside a portion of your design and or graphic production budget for those things. And other things like, high res scanning. It's not cheap, but you may need to do it for your graphics. So keep a lot of things on your list. You can always take them off if you're not going to use them, but it's better to think of them in advance.
We will be providing a follow-up white paper on our website with some of the answers to these questions that we didn't get to today. And they range from specific questions about cost per square foot about museum types, like does a history museum cost more than an art museum, cost more than a science museum, or how museum building costs are trending. So we're unfortunately not going to be able to get to those questions while we're live here together. So,
but I will say that that benchmarking is an important thing, and what you do is try and find comparable organizations or project types, and then do your benchmarking study from there. So that way you're at least getting into a comparable and do an investigation with that. That's one.
Yeah, and I just wanted to bring up one other item that we touched upon, but we didn't drill down on, and I know there's some questions around this, which is how important community engagement is in the early parts of projects. I think the pandemic has really thrown a huge spotlight on those museums who were not serving their communities in really holistic and meaningful ways. They were the ones who sort of went by, they've had a lot of problems budgetarily. But this is something that, as far as soft costs, because people oftentimes don't understand how to pay for that, or they think they don't understand the cost of it. So for me, for instance, I put my role as a facilitator for community engagement. And what does that mean? It can mean town halls, it can mean stakeholder interviews, it could mean a survey of some digital sort, it can be group meetings, focus groups. The consultant or someone who facilitates that may put the cost of their time in there, but there are additional costs to get those people in the room. You might be buying lunch for 100 people. You might be renting a room. You might, so there are all kinds of, I just want to bring that out as a soft cost we haven't touched on, because I feel like philosophically, it's an enormously important part of an exhibition development process that needs to be accounted for. So don't let that go by the wayside and think that number one, it's free, and number two, you shouldn't spend the money on it because you might be not developing the right project for your community.
Yeah, and I stand corrected. I was ready to close out here at 60 minutes, and I understand we're actually going for another half hour yet. So I apologize for that. I had a little bit of a flustering moment because my power went off because of the hurricane bomb that hit New England here. The crew was out on the street, and I disappeared for a while there. So I'm had a little bit of a panic attack. I apologize for that. So I'm going to keep going with some of these questions. And let me say that if you're out there in the audience, if you give a thumbs up or a like to the questions, they rise to the top of the queue. It indicates to me as your host that that's a question that more people are interested in hearing. So if you see a question that resonates for you, please give it a thumbs up and it will rise to the top of the queue. So here's one from the top of the queue. Was there variance in a cost per square foot depending on museum types? For example, history museum versus art museum versus other?
I'll answer that. So I think we did not include art museums in this because art museums are kind of in a category of their own. They're usually very well, and we just finished one up a couple of years ago, Glenstone here in Potomac, Maryland, that the client spent a lot of money, $280 million on that project, including all the site and the buildings and the landscaping, and those kinds of things are sometimes not easy to quantify or even make public. So I think art museums are in a category of their own. I think that, again, I think we talked about this before with doing benchmarking. I think if you're planning a science museum, you should be benchmarking other science museums and visiting them. And that will help point the way.
Chris, can you share just a little bit about what the benchmarking process looks like for you or what it should look like?
Sure. Well, and it depends in the feasibility period. If there's a museum planner or you're working with an exhibit designer to do the master planning, it's part of the investigation of figuring out. You have people in the industry who know what those other comparable institutions are. You should go visit them, right? I mean, people who think they're going to do a new museum and are not museum geeks, studying all the different latest things going on in museums, that's not great. You have to be really a student and understand the business you're in. And a lot of, sometimes museum clients are like, oh, I'm in the museum business now.
Here's a popular question. How does working in a design build scenario versus a design bid build scenario change the budget?
Oh, I'd be happy to talk about that a little bit. So design build scenario is where you have all of your project partners at the table day one. So your design team, your fabricator, your media producer, media hardware, lighting hardware, everybody's there from day one. Whereas with design bid build, you primarily work on the design, maybe media production, and then a finished or semi-complete design goes out to bid. So the way that can impact costs is, when you're sending out a relatively complete design for bid, people are bidding what they see. You can look at, as Trent mentioned, sometimes you're going to get low bids where things are left out or where people didn't think about things. Other times, you're going to get really high bids because something may not be fully defined and you've got to put in an allowance. So often you actually end up spending more money, though there are fewer humans working on the first half of the job. And that's because within design build, while you have everybody at the table day one, you're able to continually evaluate costs from the first day of concept all the way through DD. You're able to make small adjustments along the way rather than value engineering and cutting once bids come in over budget. So that's at least been my experience working on both the museum side and the design and fabrication side is while you do have a bit more effort up front with the design build, you're able to make critical decisions along the way instead of backpedaling and often redesigning to get into budget at the end.
I'd like to add a couple of comments about design build, because when I do a museum budget, my budgets are based on the design that I'm seeing from the designer. And I see each iteration and adjust my pricing as a result of it, I don't find a particular difference in the cost of the exhibits in terms of whether it was a design build or a design and bid situation. And that may be because I'm looking at the drawings that are going to get built. It doesn't matter to me who designed them. There may be some savings in time, energy, understanding if you're working directly with the designer who's also going to build it. But you can get those same relationships if you're very careful about who you choose to work with. And I've found that design build firms often are they're more interested in working directly with the client because they're going to be there the whole way. Not that designers would say, well, I don't want to work with this person anymore.
Right.
But there's a continuity that you get, and that's important. But as far as the actual cost of the exhibits, it has more impact on the overall budget cost than just the exhibit fabrication costs. And that's, again, in my experience.
And I think, just to jump in, I think the cost at this phase of, like, you're just starting your journey, right? And you're thinking, what do we want to spend on exhibits? I don't think the procurement method is going to influence it one way or the other. And one of the things we haven't talked about, and when you get to the point of getting a fabricator on board, and whether you do design bid, build, or a design build, the clients often have very specific ideas about how they want to hire those folks. And if it's, north of a couple $1 million, the clients I've seen usually are uncomfortable just negotiating something with the fabricator. No offense to any of the fabricators on board here, just because they don't know that they're getting the right price, right? And I think there's a bit more magic behind what goes on in this type of the business with the exhibit fabrication costs. So I think, anyway, we have to follow our clients' lead on that, because sometimes if they're a nonprofit or even a government organization, they have to do design bid build. I think if you're doing a smaller project or a very specific thing, design build is a great way to go if you have someone who's capable of doing it all. And there's a mixed bag of success and challenges of doing design build. So
I think the procurement issue is something that can often interfere with the ability to choose your favorite fabricator or designer. And often, as you mentioned, it's due to involvement of a government body, and they have to monitor more closely. But if you have the freedom, I always advise my clients that the best way to get the best project at the best price is to find someone you trust and you enjoy working with, define a scope accurately with them, and work out the budget accurately with them, and then get everybody to sign on, and you go from there. It's not really often that you can do it that way, but I find it the most enjoyable and probably the most effective way. So it's something to keep in mind if you have that flexibility.
Another question here. Curious if you have any data on square foot construction costs for the building itself. Are museums still trending in the $700 per square foot range? And has COVID impacted this rate?
I would say that this is for new construction, I'm assuming. I would say the average is probably more than 700, and I'm working on a couple of projects right now where it's closer to $900,000 to $1,000 a square foot. But again, I think it depends on the site. I mean, like if you're building parking and extensive landscaping and you have to do stormwater management and bring utilities to your building, again, that's expensive stuff. And just for the building itself. And again, if you're designing a museum that has a big statement to it, it's, who knows? So I think it is really important to get, I think it's fine to have a target range of 700. I think as a process goes, it's always good to have a design to budget, and then make sure that whoever you hire agrees that they're going to design to that budget. One of the conversations we were having earlier today, this is related but separate, is actually when clients are trying to hire their architect, identifying, or the designer, identifying what their budget is. And sometimes clients are hesitant to tell the people who are taking a look at this project what their budget is. And it's a crazy little dance and it's really frustrating because it's a designer can start to work on a project. If they don't know what the budget is, they're like, oh, great, let's design the most fabulous thing ever. And then you come back later and it's way out of budget of what they really wanted to spend. So it's better to have those conversations early and upfront.
I think that's true throughout the project. And there's always this idea that if you reveal your budget to the fabricator, for instance, they'll just design and build to your budget. But that's really what you want.
What's wrong with that?
Yeah, that's exactly the point. And I've not that I spent a lot of time studying the psychology of estimating and negotiating, but there are studies out there that indicate that everybody at the table will be more successful if more information is shared. And I think that's important to keep in mind. If you tell the fabricator what your budget is, they may say, well, okay, I'm going to have to be creative on this one. I'll sharpen my pencil, or I'll come up with some solutions for you. And if they're operating in the dark, then it's sort of like playing, what's Battleship, where you take a shot and they say, nope, you missed. That's just a waste of time, really.
Just to add on that, you could be planning the Taj Mahal or a double wide trailer. Square footage is square footage, but they're not the same. And one thing that really doesn't fit within square footage is interactive multimedia, because you could spend $500,000 on that. That's not even a foot, or $500,000 on a very large area. Some things are not necessarily square footage, so you really have to be clear about what your dream is, what you want to get to, and how much money you really have. You really want to have people who can say, that may not be possible. How else can we do this? Still sticking to your big idea and your big goal.
So that's a great segue. There's a question here about what makes a useful big idea, or what is a valuable project objective, and can we provide some samples of those perhaps? It's easy to fall into a trap where big ideas are not that useful and then they don't get used. They get ignored.
Well, I'm going to beat the drum of community involvement. You can all sit around the table and think that you know what your community wants. You have a great idea. You have a mission. You're a museum that already has a mission. You're growing, you're changing, you're renovating, you're expanding, you're moving, or you're what I like to call a civic entrepreneur. You're trying to bring a museum to your community and you think you know what everybody wants and you have a great big idea. Well, if you haven't really talked to, just a whole bunch of different kinds of folks in your community, your big idea might fall flat on its face. As far as like giving examples, it really depends on what that project is, what the genre of museum you're talking about, what the size of the community, what are your resources? They all kind of feed into what your big idea should be. I don't know, Matt, if you have any other thoughts about that. You work in this zone a lot.
Yeah, I do work in this realm a lot, and I have started to, the idea of the big idea has been in practice, gosh, since Beverly Sorrell published her first book and gave it that term in the 80s, and I think that our industry has expanded beyond just the useful singular big idea anymore. I have added the essential questions. So not only do we articulate a big idea for the overall space, but a big idea for, there's kind of a nested idea more than I think it used to be. A big idea for the entire experience, sub ideas for dedicated spaces and experiences, and then essential questions that visitors might bring to the table. There are varying schools of thought for how to articulate a big idea.
And the whole idea that maybe you want people to learn this, you want them to think this, but you want them to feel a certain way. What are those parameters? And when somebody comes in and says, "Hey, we have the coolest, latest, greatest VR," but that has nothing to do with what you're doing, you can very confidently say, "No, that doesn't fit. I'm sorry, Thomas, I interrupted you."
No, that's quite right. I was just going to say that on the topic of big ideas, we all have had experience going to museums that had plenty of wonderful ideas. And when you left, you said, I don't really know what that was about. And it's not because there's anything wrong with the design or they aren't wonderful exhibits. The point is that if you can get your visitors to leave your museum with one big idea, then you've probably accomplished what any museum should be happy to accomplish. And defining that big idea is part of your planning. And
Isn't that
if you get
part
to
of
the
what
end of your planning and you can't show any evidence that that big idea got across, then maybe the planning failed somewhere.
Yeah, in our interpretive planning work, we I guess the shorthand version is we think of things for the head, the heart, and the hands. You know, what are the cognitive communication aims, the learning goals, the big idea stated as a takeaway message, but then also how are we going to touch their hearts? What are the emotional outcomes that we want to be at cause for in the design? Is it a cacophonous space? Is it a place of sanctuary and solitude? What is it experientially? And then also the hands component. What are people going to do while they're here? If all they're going to do is shuffle their feet and read panels, then we haven't really engaged their whole bodies in a way that we might be able to. So we really think in terms of heart, head, and hand in order to develop those objectives.
Could I
Let's
just
see.
ask that we address a few of the questions we got when we sent out our invitation? We asked everyone, what are you doing a project, planning a project, and what about that project haunts your dreams? And a lot of those questions had to do with the fear of over or underestimating. And I would like to address some of that. But first, I think one of the big questions is about digital experiences, and I think Trent should address that.
A digital experience, there is an idea of like, oh, it'll be cool. Cool for cool's sake is silly. I mean, you go somewhere else for that. Cool, whatever you're creating, that interaction should further the knowledge, the feeling, whatever it is you're trying to get across. And also, just because you can put everything in the kitchen sink in doesn't mean you should. There is a habit that, oh, there's so much we want to tell, so we'll put it all in a touch screen. If you can avoid that, do it, because nobody in the world needs more screens just for a screen's sake. It's great if you can be a little bit more magical and look at it. Just because you could take every single graphic in your museum and put it in a touch screen doesn't make it cheaper, but really look at why you're doing it. If you can't answer the why for any interactive or media, then it's probably a bad idea that costs too much.
I think one of the important issues about estimating and pricing digital experiences is that you can take casework, you can take murals, you can make square foot costs to apply to just about everything. But it's, in my experience, nearly impossible to apply a square foot cost to a media experience. You can have a tiny box that's giving you $1 million worth of information and programming, and applying a square foot cost to that doesn't really give you a good view of it. And to address the question about how you estimate, how you extrapolate a budget, I remember I used to work for Neil Deaton. Some of you may know the man. And someone asked a question about, well, how much does an exhibit cost? And he said, well, how long is a rope? The real question is, how do you define what you're trying to do? And if someone says, well, it's just so big, I don't know where to start. Well, then start big and say, is this going to cost $10 million or $10? You can set a range. A rational person and a rational group of people can start to narrow down that range. I mean, we've all seen The Price is Right. Some people are good at guessing prices, other people aren't. But you can always start with reality. It's not going to be $50 a square foot. but it's not going to be $10,000 a square foot.
And for
It's
interaction.
important to get help. Exactly. You can say, well, I have this much. Of course, it would be self-serving of me to say, well, you should always hire me and I'll tell you what it costs. But budgeting is a different thing than estimating.
Yeah.
And I can help with budgeting. We can all help with budgeting. Designers can help with budgeting. You need the experts on your team.
The one thing I want to say about media and interactivity, the two things you should keep in mind: how much content. If you have a whole bunch of content, it's going to cost more. If you don't have as much content, of course, it'll be lighter. And how complex is the development? Are you doing something that's very cutting edge, never been done before, or something that, oh, everybody knows how to do? Just keep those in mind. I can't tell you how much they cost, but more content and complex development costs more.
There's another question that just popped up about a museum in Kenya, which was one of the original questions submitted. And Kathleen, I think you and I discussed how we would answer that question, but since they've put it into the Q&A, maybe we should try and address that right now.
Yeah, I think you're right, Tom. This is definitely building a museum from the ground up is no small task. And especially building one where it's never been done before. I don't know if this is near other existing museums or the first in the region, but yeah, first of all, hopefully we've been helpful in this webinar and giving you some tips and tricks and information that's going to be helpful to start setting parameters. But I guess something to think about is, there are so many independent estimators, fabricators, partners who can come alongside you in the process to start beginning to assign budget numbers. So maybe starting out from the concept level and a simple cost per square foot budget based on what you expect to have. What kind of media do you envision? What kind of finishes? What kind of experiences? Are there artifacts? Are there large objects? So considering the overall vision is often helpful for that very first step. And then beginning the design process, ensuring you have someone on the team who's a qualified cost estimator. So Tom, I'm going to hand it off to you as a qualified cost estimator.
Well, I appreciate that. And it is important. I know designers, construction managers, people who build buildings can all give you good direction on how to get a budget in place. And to address the question of whether it's a different price per square foot in different countries, that hasn't necessarily been my experience. But you have to take into consideration the fact that if you're going to work with an exhibit firm in the US, you have to add shipping costs. If you can work with a construction and design firm on your continent, at least, you're going to save that money. But in the end, a good experience is going to cost within a range. And we could have a whole nother webinar about how we gathered our data and how we analyzed it. But again, our point really comes down to that you need to have people who are very experienced. Not everyone has to have all years of experience like some of us do. You can see by the color of my hair anyway that I've got a lot of it, but you need to have some people who have experience, and it's important to mix your team up.
I think you're right, Tom. And I think also somebody made a point a minute ago that having someone who's knowledgeable in the local marketplace, I'm sure there have been museums or other cultural buildings that have been built there. I think you have to think about, again, the design and construction of the building. If you're building a new museum, that's one project. And then the museum component or exhibits is a whole separate project. It's the box within the box. It's really two separate design teams. And so.
Yeah, and also thinking about different countries. I mean, I will say, like, our firm has worked in many countries around the world, and we've, in that process, oftentimes museums will task us with helping them build partnerships. And if there's not, say, a local fabricator let's find people locally who we can train up in how to actually do that. So when your museum is built, you have people to continue helping you with that museum and growing that up in other places. We worked on a project in Sofia, Bulgaria, and it was the very first children's museum in Eastern Europe. And there just simply weren't exhibit fabricators in Eastern Europe at the time. This has been several years now. But part of our job as the fabricator was training local people to be able to fabricate exhibits. So that's something you may want to consider as you go through this process, is how can your museum benefit your community and being able to grow up other museums and other cultural institutions in your region as you progress.
Real
Another,
quick, I saw the question in here about, low bids. Yeah, we've all seen where we see a bit of.
so Trent, the attendees cannot see the question, so I'm gonna read that one.
Okay.
I have bid on projects and later through the Public Records Act gotten copies of other bidders' proposals. I am shocked at the ranges. Do you find that companies are intentionally underbidding to get work? Any suggestions for defending appropriate budgets in proposals?
And I would say this is not necessarily museums. This is everywhere. People, there's a tendency to go towards commodity and commodity pricing. And absolutely, there are many companies, not just in our business, but all over, that have to underbid. That in order to get the work, they're going to underbid and they're going to make their money on the overages. And you're going to hit, all the change orders. If you've ever hired a contractor and gone with the lowest bid, you discovered that yourself. It is a practice that a lot of companies do. And it isn't that they're bad. It's that that's how the entire world has been going. But you just want to be aware, if you are going with somebody that's their practice, you're going to be spending more later in change orders. And as far as defending your costs, it's tough. I mean, I don't know how you defend your costs except explain why yours are more all in. That said, if it's government, you may not have a choice there. It may just be the lowest cost wins.
Yeah, and I will say, I've been on your end, I'm assuming, whoever you are, anonymous attendee. But yeah, you're right. There are some bids that win that are absurd. And, at the end of the day, go back to the slide, you get what you pay for. But often, there are companies that aren't necessarily even, you'll have a general contractor go after an exhibits project and just farm it out to tiny shops. And that is what's happening. So it's tricky, especially with government projects, because those typically are a low bid situation. Some are underbidding in my world to get work. So hopefully, that's where we go back to find those reputable partners, do your homework. I think there was a question we didn't get to about how do you find good partners? It's really invest in the relationship. Don't make it transactional. Get to know who you're working with. And if you like who you're working with and you develop that trust up front, you're less likely to have issues down the road.
I think there's another, to me, interesting aspect of this. I know that spreadsheets and budgeting and estimating put a lot of people to sleep, but having done these budget estimates and reviewed bids over time, there are aspects that are unrelated to the design itself that increase the cost, that are more related to the RFP. Obviously, another webinar can be done about this if we haven't already. But one thing about pricing is the more line item prices you request, probably the higher your overall cost is going to be, because you're going to make the estimator a little nervous, and you'll make the fabricator a little nervous. They may think you want to cherry pick. They may think that you're going to shop it around and see if you can get the lowest price for each item from a different person. But one of the things I tell my clients, and that I've seen in practice, when you put together a very detailed line item budget and ask people to fill it out, the totals at the bottom may be identical, but each line item will vary so wildly that you'll have no idea how they came up with that price. And there are a lot of reasons that they might have done that. They might have loaded some items that they think are the core of the exhibit that they know won't be deleted with more of the profits. The point is that when you go back to the bidding process, you have to evaluate the bidders and you have to be very careful about the low bids. We didn't want to talk about the disaster stories, but I have been an exhibit director who had to take a low bid because the board says, no, save the money. It's your job to make sure they do it for that price. And we have seen a museum that as we mentioned before, where the fabrication firm went out of business because they bought that project at a low price. And so it's important that you have your eyes open all the time and not just at the dollar signs, not just the height of your budget and say, wow, I'm saving a lot of money with this guy. Make sure that they can do it for that price and not just by reading the specs back to you.
Thanks, Tom. That's a good place to end. And we want to thank everyone who joined us for this Praxis Museum Projects Group and National Association for Museum Exhibition webinar on museum projects budgeting. Like all of our webinars, you can rewatch this, you can rewind it, you can share it from our website. It will be posted shortly as soon as it processes. There's a webinar tab at the very top of the Praxis website. We aim to provide webinars at least quarterly, so please stay tuned for more programming in the new year. And we wish you enjoyable and innovative museum projects free from the stresses of unanticipated budget-related issues. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.